Hello Steelers and welcome to this bumper video of jungle terrain building. Two Fat Lardies have recently released their Far East handbook and there is a need in there for jungle terrain to cover your tabletop. However, this terrain can be used for many other periods and theatres and even different worlds, so it should be useful to you whatever you game. In turn, we'll go through making rubber tree plantations, bamboo clusters, paddy fields and then finally Japanese bunkers. I've tried to minimise using specialist tools and materials, and everything I can do can be bought on eBay or substitutes can be used instead. However, I will also put a list of materials in the description down below. One thing to note from the beginning is that although I'm making one example of each, it is easier and quicker for you to make several pieces of the same type at once, and you'll soon have your table full of lush jungle. Okay, let's begin with the rubber tree plantations. These regimented ranks of trees are found across the Far East and were a major aspect of a lot of the fighting during the Second World War. I used some 2mm thick plasticard to make the base of the trees. Plasticard is not cheap, but it is durable and it won't warp. Cut this to whatever size you want, but for mine I measured about 3cm wide and about 15cm long, or about an inch wide and about 6 inches long if you're using Imperial. I'm making mine for 15mm scale, but this would work equally well just for 28mm scale as well. I mark out the plasticard and then carefully cut with a scalpel and just snap the sheets off at the line. Then I round off the sharp edges with some clippers and smooth them down with a file. This is to reduce the sharpness of the corner and just make them blend into the table a little bit more. You don't really have to do this, I just prefer the look of an organic terrain piece. Then I roughly mark where I want each of the trees to go along the line of the plasticard. You can either do this by eye by placing the trees next to the card and ensuring there's space between them, or just by measuring them out. Then, with those positions marked, I use my knockoff Dremel drill to drill a hole in each position. If you don't have a drill, just use a pointed scalpel to drill out the hole instead. I'm using cheap trees from eBay for this, and I ensure that each one fits into the hole, making the hole a little bit bigger if not, or just shaving down the trunk of the tree to fit. Then once they're in position and snug, I use a glue gun to seal each tree to the plasticard. Again here, if you don't have a glue gun, just use some super glue or whatever else you have at hand. But be warned, super glue can be quite brittle when it's set, so do keep that in mind. Now there's probably a small nub of the tree peg below the plasticard, so carefully and using a sharp blade I snip off each one as close as I can get to the plasticard. It might be worth just gently filing them down as well to ensure that the card has a flat surface on the base. Then I use a big and old brush to apply AK Interactive's Dark Earth Terrain Paste. This is a paste that has a texture included and is acrylic, so it washes off the brush easily in water. There are plenty of these types of paste on the market these days, but this is the one that I use. Just ensure that the base of the trees is completely covered and then leave it to dry, preferably overnight. Once the terrain paste is completely dry, I then begin dry brushing Deco Art Fawn over the top with a big soft brush. This is cheap and cheerful paint, but it is a good highlight for mud. To dry brush, apply some paint to your brush, wipe off the excess on a cloth or a towel and then gently brush across the top of the dried paste, leaving some paint on the raised areas. It does take some practice to not only get the right amount of paint and the technique, but you can always reapply the terrain paste if you get it wrong and then just try again when it's dry. To make the trunks of the trees look slightly less plasticky, I apply a dose of Agrax Earthshade to each trunk. This is a brownish wash from Citadel and has a nice way of working into all the nooks and crannies of the tree trunks. It also dulls down that bright brown plasticky look. You can go a bit further and also use a spray matte varnish to dull the colours again when this is dry, but I didn't bother. Next I use undiluted PVA glue and I paint it liberally around the edges of the base. Then I add static grass to stick to the glue when it's wet. For this I don't use an applicator, but I just blow on the grass once it's in the glue and it stands up okay. Finally I add some grass tufts of different sizes just to break up the base a little. These can be bought for pennies off eBay and they really add a little bit more to your terrain. And here they are, the completed rubber trees. I also sprayed these with Geek Gaming sealant spray as the foliage on the trees can be a little bit messy, but this was a nice, quick and easy project to complete. Right, next we are going to turn to the bamboo clusters. These are found throughout the jungle areas of Southeast Asia and can be used as blocking terrain to impede progress or just to break up the rest of your jungle table. To make the base I use again 2mm plasticard and I mark out rough circles and organic shapes that I want the base to be using a marker pen. Then I trim out the basic shape using a craft knife, being careful with the blade as this can be quite tricky. A way to do this is score the card and then just snap off the piece in one go. I use a craft knife to trim off the excess and clean up the edges with a file. Then I grab some 5mm thick foam card mounting board. These are just some scraps I had left over, but I cut it to a rough circle to the size of the plastic card, but also with a little bit of overlap. Then I super glue the plastic card to the mounting foam, leaving that overlap. Then using a sharp knife, I cut the foam board down to size, using the plastic card as a template, trying to make sure that the two fit snugly together. Then I shape the edge of the foam board with the knife, cutting at an angle to create a slope. You can make this as steep or as gentle as you like, depending on your preference. However, making it gentler will reduce the amount of space that you have on top for the bamboo. Then I apply AK Interactive Terrain Paste with a brush. The colour of this will depend on the theatre you are wanting to use the terrain pieces in, but I like the typical mud brown colour as I'm using here. When the paste has dried sufficiently, I dry brush it using, again, Deco Arts Fawn, just to emphasise the raised areas of the paste. And this, as before, is the same as I did for the rubber trees. Then we want to make the fallen leaf foliage that is seen on the jungle floor. For this, I paint undiluted PVA glue across the base, but I don't entirely cover it, just in large patches and leaving some of the earth showing through here and there. Then I sprinkle Italian dried herbs over the top. These can be bought in any supermarket herbs and spices aisle. They also smell nice. As you can see, I do all this in a tub just to try to minimise mess and also making clearing up the herbs a little bit easier. Then, keeping the base in a tub, I apply watered down PVA glue to the herbs. I do this using a dropper, but you could use a squirting bottle or sealant from Geek Gaming for example. Whatever you use, just make sure that the herbs will be set in place. This will take at least overnight to dry, so I put them to one side for now. Once the PVA glue has dried and the herbs are set in place, I use a big brush to apply watered down flat earth paint from Vallejo. I ensure that I cover the herbs completely. I don't worry about it going onto the earth showing through below, as it will also just add some more texture to the piece anyway. Leaving the ink wash herbs to dry again, preferably overnight, I then dry brush cheap acrylic called sap green over the top of the herbs just to highlight the raised areas. Then I dry brush leaf green over the top of this just to really give it a highlight. Then it's time to tackle the bamboo itself. These are cheap bamboo aquarium plants from eBay, and they come in large bags full of individual pieces. The plastic colour is too bright, so I use sap green brushed on heavily as a base coat. You can also spray these in whatever colour you want. And then I go back and I dry brush leaf green over the edges of the leaves and the foliage just to emphasise them and again give them a bit of depth. The bamboo plants are made around metal sticks, so they are easy to pierce into the foam board using a dab of super glue on the end and pushing them into the foam. I also cut them using clippers to different sizes to give the piece some variety. Finally, I add grass tufts and lumps of Green Stuff World's foliage to the base to break up the shape a little, and also add smaller plants growing around the bottom of the bamboo. And that's it, another easy terrain piece added to the collection. Now it's time to turn to the paddy fields that were staple of the many Southeastern Asian countries. These provide the rice that is vital to many people's lives in the area. And here we're going to make a paddy field that is in use and also a paddy field that is dry. I turn back to my trusty plastic card once again for this, and using a full sheet I draw a rough line down the centre to make two fields. I score this and snap the card to make two separate fields. Then I cut the corners with clippers to make the fields look more organic and file these down smooth to make them blend into the table a little bit more than having those sharp edges. I then take a sheet of foam mounting board which is about 5mm thick. I'm making these paddy fields for 15mm, so if you want to make them for 28mm figures, use thicker foam mounting board, just to bring the height up to the right level. I cut out strips roughly a centimetre wide using a sharp knife. Using super glue, I then glue a strip down on the edge of the plastic card base and trim it off where there is overhang on the corners. I also round them off a little bit here as well. I add 4 strips, cutting them down as I go, making sure they fit around the entire edge of the field. Once the glue has set, I use a knife to trim and shape the edges of the foam board, trying to make this look as organic as possible, but also leaving a walkway area around the top of the bund. Now I'm going to go old school with this, and there's a reason for using polyfiller here rather than the terrain paste I've used previously. I add polyfiller to the edges of the field, building up a bund on the top of the foam board. Polyfiller is cheap, and it fills the space as easily and works better for this than the expensive terrain pastes. It's also slightly more hard wearing when it's completely dry. Then for the paddy field that is in use, I use undiluted PVA glue and paint it on the bund of the field, ensuring that I don't get any of the glue on the flat part of the field. The next stage is to sprinkle silver sand over the bund areas to cover them in some form of texture. This is just a fine sand and it can be bought at any builder's merchants. For the dry paddy field, I do the same with the undiluted PVA, but I also paint it across the base of the field as well, and then I cover the entire field in silver sand. Once the PVA is dried, take the fields outside and spray them using burnt umber spray. Make sure you get a good coverage across the entire fields and even give it a second coat if you think it's needed. This spray will help the sand to set and it's much easier than using a brush for this. The next stage is to dry brush the two fields using Deco Art Fawn again and a big soft brush to pick up the raised areas of the sand. Then I go back with Vallejo's German Camo Beige and dry brush a small walkway around the top of each bund to represent the hard packed soil from where people would have walked around the edges of the fields. For the field in use, I want to represent the muddy water that is seen in paddy fields as the rice grows. So for this, I use any dark green that looks good and I paint it on in a thick layer. Before it is dried, I add a lighter brown, something like Vallejo's Flat Earth will work well here. I paint rough stripes of this across the surface, then I use a big stiff brush to stipple the two colours together whilst they're still wet. If you really want, you can add more colours to this, but I was happy with the effect here. And then to make the water effect, you've got a couple of choices. You can add a modelling water product like resin to the base in a thin layer, and this will work very nicely, but an easier and quicker way is to simply paint the base of the field in gloss varnish. Then, once the varnish has dried, I begin adding static grass to the bund of the field. I paint undiluted PVA glue around the inner edge, avoiding the area of the path as grass wouldn't be growing there. Then I sprinkle static grass over the glue and blow on it to let the static grass stand up. I then do the same on the outer edge of the bund. For the dry field I do similar, but I also cover the base of the field in PVA glue and cover this in static grass as well, to show that the field is fallow. To finish off, I add crops in the field by using small grass tufts that I buy off eBay and adding them in rows across the field. These rows do not have to be perfect as paddy fields were planted by hand. Just add as many of these as you like. Use fewer for a field that is only just in use and the rice is growing, or more for a fully growing field. It's entirely your choice. I finish off by adding a few more grass tufts on both fields on the bund and also on the base of the field that is out of use, and then that's them completed. And finally I'm going to turn my attention to the Japanese bunkers. These are specific to the Second World War, but they could easily be used in science fiction games and the like. I had a bunch of 2-inch diameter MDF bases which I bought from war bases, so I used these as the basis for the bunkers. I roughly measured around them on some 5cm thick foam mounting board, and I cut the foam board down to size with a knife, slightly smaller than the measurement. I then cut a smaller circle from the foam board and superglued the two together on top of the MDF base. Once the glue had dried, I cut a flat front on one side of the bunker and then carved out the edges of the rest in a slope. I used a sharp knife for this and I ensured that I was careful around my fingers. Then I took some toothpicks and cut them down to the approximate lengths for the tree logs that were used by the Japanese in their defensive positions. I superglued these into place against the front edge that I'd cut straight earlier, and I used very small pieces for the upright and the aperture. Next, I covered the bunker in polyfiller to give it a smooth surface and also to add some strength to the piece. Once the polyfiller was completely dry, I used a file to smooth down any lumps and bumps that I could see. I still wanted it to look messy like piled earth, so I didn't do too much of this. Then I painted undiluted PVA glue over the dried polyfiller and sprinkled silver sand over the glue. This will help with strengthening the bunkers for gaming purposes. Rather than using a brush to paint the bunkers as it can dislodge the sand, I sprayed burnt umber spray over the entire bunker, including into the aperture to give it a dark interior. Once the spray was dry, I turned back to Deco Art Fawn and dry brushed this across the sand to pick out the details once again. Then it was time to paint the logs for the opening, and for the base coat of these I used German Camo Beige by Vallejo and just painted it on as neat as I could. When this had dried, I added Agrax Earth Shade to the wooden logs to add a bit of depth to the shading and also bring out the nooks and crannies. Once the Agrax had dried, I went back and dry brushed Stone Grey by Vallejo over the top just to pick out the grain and add a bit of depth to the logs. Then, as before, I used undiluted PVA glue to cover the bunker in static grass by painting the glue over the bunker, then sprinkling the static grass over that. You could also add the Italian herbs from before, but I didn't bother this time. Then to finish off the bunker, I added some grass tufts and other foliage to break up the shape of the structure, and it was finished. Well, that was the last of 4 jungle terrain pieces in this video. I have another video on the channel dealing with making bigger jungle terrain, so I recommend you go and watch that as well. But I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. Let me know in the comments, but please also like and subscribe and check out my Patreon and channel memberships if you want to help to support the channel, and I'll see you in the next Storm of Steel video.